A billionaire tech brat insults what he thinks is a washed-up actor on a first-class flight, filming himself mocking the quiet passenger for social media clout. The arrogant punk and his crew laugh as they humiliate the older man, grabbing his book and threatening to make him dance for their entertainment. But this soft-spoken traveler reading about Eastern philosophy isn't just some has-been celebrity. This is Steven Seagal himself. The billionaire has no idea he just picked a fight with a federal agent who spent decades breaking bones with nothing but precise finger pressure. While the tech mogul waves his phone around like a weapon, the Aikido master sits perfectly still, calculating exactly how many seconds it would take to shatter every bone in the punk's wrist. The other passengers watch in growing anticipation as the bully pushes harder, completely unaware he's taunting a man who could kill him with a pencil. What happens when unlimited arrogance meets unlimited skill at 30,000 feet? Will the billionaire survive discovering why some quiet men should never be disturbed? What happened next would terrorize the tech brat for the rest of his pathetic existence. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of LAX Terminal 7 hummed overhead as Steven Seagal moved through the evening crowd with practiced invisibility. At 73, he still carried his imposing 6'4" frame with the fluid grace that had made him legendary. But tonight he was just another passenger in simple black clothing, cotton shirt, comfortable pants, soft-soled shoes that made no sound on the polished floor. His weathered hands gripped a small leather bag and a worn copy of the Book of Five Rings, the ancient text on strategy and warfare that had guided samurai for centuries. To the harried travelers rushing past, he appeared to be nothing more than an aging man catching a late flight. They had no idea they were looking at a federal agent on one of the most dangerous missions of his career. Target confirmed at the Fairmont Hotel in Tokyo, came the voice through his nearly invisible earpiece. Agent Rebecca Martinez, his handler at the Joint FBIDA Task Force, spoke with the crisp efficiency of someone who'd spent 20 years hunting international criminals. Viktor Kozlov arrived this morning with a shipping container full of stolen military hardware, drones, missiles, communication equipment, enough firepower to outfit a small army. Seagal's dark eyes remained fixed ahead as he approached Gate 52, but his mind cataloged every detail Martinez provided. Viktor Kozlov, former Soviet Spetsnaz colonel turned arms dealer, responsible for putting American weapons into the hands of terrorists and criminals across 3 continents. The kind of predator who profited from other people's suffering without losing a moment's sleep. The middleman, Seagal asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the terminal noise. Bradley Mansfield, CEO of CyberVault Technologies. His encryption software makes the payments untraceable. We've been watching him for months, but he's been careful until now. This Tokyo meeting is our chance to take down the entire network. The boarding announcement for Flight 447 to Tokyo echoed across the terminal. Seagal glanced at his ticket, Seat 3A, first class. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent decades playing action heroes on movie screens, and now he was living it for real, hunting genuine monsters instead of Hollywood villains. As he approached the gate, a commotion near the priority boarding line caught his attention. A loud voice cut through the ambient noise, complaining about everything from the gate agent's efficiency to the peasants cluttering up the boarding area. Bradley Mansfield had arrived. Seagal recognized him immediately from the surveillance. Photos, average height, soft build, expensive clothes that screamed new money. The billionaire moved with the entitled swagger of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions, flanked by an entourage that hung on his every word, like courtiers serving a petty king. But what drew Seagal's focus was the titanium briefcase handcuffed to Mansfield's wrist. According to intercepted communications, that case contained the quantum encryption keys that would unlock $500 million in cryptocurrency, blood money that would complete the largest arms deal in Kozlov's criminal career. Seagal settled into the boarding line, the Book of Five Rings open in his hands as he began the meditation breathing that would center him for the long flight ahead. Around him, ordinary people rushed toward ordinary destinations, unaware that their flight carried both a federal agent and the technology that could arm the next generation of terrorists. The game was about to begin. Bradley Mansfield's arrival at Gate 52 was less an entrance than an invasion. The billionaire swept through the priority boarding area like a celebrity dictator, his voice carrying over every conversation as he loudly critiqued the airline's service, the gate agent's competence, and the general inconvenience of sharing space with common travelers. At 45, Mansfield had built CyberVault Technologies from nothing into a $2 billion empire, but success had transformed him into something ugly. His carefully styled brown hair was beginning to thin, and his manicured hands had never known honest work, yet he carried himself as if the world owed him constant deference. "Derek, make sure they understand about the champagne," he barked at his personal assistant, a nervous young man who scribbled notes on an expensive tablet. "None of that domestic swill. I want the Cristal, and I want it chilled properly this time." Derek Paulson nodded frantically, clearly accustomed to his boss's impossible demands. Beside him, Casey Wright, Mansfield's social media manager, filmed everything for the billionaire's various online platforms. The third member of the entourage, bodyguard Marcus Stone, looked distinctly uncomfortable with his employer's behavior. The ex-Marine's weathered face carried the expression of a professional soldier forced to babysit a spoiled child. "Sir, perhaps we could," Marcus began, but Mansfield cut him off with a dismissive wave. "Marcus, I don't pay you to think. I pay you to look intimidating and carry bags." Other passengers in the first-class boarding line watched the display with varying degrees of disgust and fascination. Ruth Kowalski, a 78-year-old retired school principal from Brooklyn, muttered something under her breath that would have made her late husband proud. Near the gate, Jennifer Hayes adjusted her grip on 6-month-old Emma, covering the baby's ears as Mansfield's voice reached new levels of obnoxiousness. Flight attendant Linda Chen approached with the professional smile that came from years of dealing with difficult passengers. "Mr. Mansfield, welcome aboard Flight 447. We're honored to have you flying with us today." "About time someone showed proper respect," Mansfield replied, not bothering to look at her directly. "I trust my specifications were forwarded to the cabin crew." Temperature at exactly 72 degrees. Champagne served in proper crystal, and I don't want to be disturbed by any of the other passengers. Some of us have important business to conduct. His constant phone checking and nervous glances at the titanium briefcase handcuffed to his wrist suggested that important business was weighing heavily on his mind. The case never left his side, and he unconsciously adjusted its position every few minutes like a man carrying a live bomb. "Of course, sir. We'll make sure you have everything you need for a comfortable flight," Linda replied, maintaining her professional composure despite Mansfield's rudeness. "You'd better. Do you have any idea how much money I spend with this airline? I could buy 3 of these planes with what I make in a single quarter." The boarding process began, and Mansfield pushed to the front of the priority line despite having arrived last. As he strutted down the jetway, his entourage trailing behind like well-dressed servants, other passengers exchanged looks of shared embarrassment for humanity. Inside the aircraft, Mansfield claimed Seat 1A with theatrical ceremony immediately, demanding that Linda bring his champagne before takeoff, a violation of federal aviation regulations that he assumed didn't apply to billionaires. As he settled into the leather seat, adjusting his briefcase and barking orders at his staff, his attention was drawn to the quiet figure across the aisle in Seat 3A. The older man sat perfectly still, reading what appeared to be an ancient text on warfare, completely oblivious to the chaos Mansfield had created. Something about the stranger's face seemed familiar, though Mansfield couldn't quite place it. The recognition would come soon enough. 20 minutes into the flight, with the Pacific Ocean stretching endlessly below and the cabin lights dimmed for the long journey ahead, Bradley Mansfield's champagne-fueled confidence reached its peak. The Cristal had arrived exactly as demanded, and Derek had spent the takeoff period arranging his boss's laptop, tablets, and communication devices in the precise configuration Mansfield required for conducting international business. But it was the quiet passenger in 3A who had captured Mansfield's attention. The familiar face had been nagging at him since boarding, and now, with alcohol loosening his inhibitions and an audience of sycophants eager to laugh at his jokes, recognition finally dawned. "Holy shit," he said loudly enough for half the first class cabin to hear. "Derek, Casey, Look who we're flying with tonight. His entourage leaned forward attentively as Mansfield pointed across the aisle with his champagne flute. That's Steven Seagal. You know, the guy who thinks he's some kind of martial arts master? Made all those cheesy action movies back in the day. Steven Seagal continued reading The Book of Five Rings with perfect stillness, his weathered hands, holding the text steady despite the slight turbulence. His dark eyes remained focused on the ancient wisdom of strategy and combat, but his breathing had shifted almost imperceptibly from relaxed meditation to the controlled rhythm of a warrior, preparing for battle. Come on, it's definitely him. Mansfield continued, his voice growing louder as the champagne emboldened him. Look at that ponytail, that whole mystical badass thing he's got going. What's he, like 70? Still trying to convince people he's tough? Ruth Kowalski, seated 2 rows back, shot Mansfield a look that could have frozen hellfire. Jennifer. Hayes instinctively covered baby Emma's ears, though the infant was sleeping peacefully despite the billionaire's increasingly obnoxious commentary. Casey Wright, ever eager to please her employer, pulled out her phone and began filming. This is going to be huge for your social media engagement, Bradley. Celebrity sightings always go viral. Exactly what I was thinking, Mansfield grinned, standing up with his phone and moving closer to Seagal's seat. Hey everyone, look what we've got here. A real live-action movie dinosaur. The live stream began immediately, thousands of followers tuning in to watch their favorite tech billionaire mock what he perceived as a has-been celebrity. Comments flooded the screen. Is that really Seagal? Ask him to do some karate. Washed. Up loser. Mr. Seagal, Mansfield called out in a sing-song voice, his phone camera trained on the older man's profile. Steven Seagal, right? The king of straight-to-video action flicks? Come on, don't be shy. My followers want to see some of those deadly martial arts moves. Flight attendant Linda Chen noticed the disturbance and approached diplomatically. Sir, if you could please keep your voice down and return to your seat. Relax, sweetheart. I'm just having a little fun with our celebrity passenger here. Mansfield waved her off dismissively. It's not every day you get to fly with Hollywood. Royalty, right? Other passengers began to take notice. Some pulled out their own phones, drawn by the spectacle of a billionaire publicly humiliating an aging action star. Others, particularly the older passengers who remembered Seagal's heyday, looked distinctly uncomfortable with the one-sided harassment. Mansfield moved even closer, now standing directly beside Seagal's seat with his camera rolling. Seriously, though, can you show us something? Maybe break a board with your bare hands? Or is that all movie magic? The mockery in his voice was unmistakable, designed to humiliate and diminish. What Mansfield didn't realize was that every word, every gesture, every moment of filmed harassment was being cataloged by a mind trained to assess threats and calculate responses with lethal precision. That Seagal's eyes remained on his book, but those who knew how to read the signs would have noticed the subtle shift in his posture, the almost imperceptible adjustment of weight, the slight loosening of his grip on the ancient text, the way his breathing had become deeper and more controlled. The storm was gathering, and Bradley Mansfield had no idea he was about to learn the difference between Hollywood fantasy and deadly reality. Come on, don't be shy, Bradley Mansfield continued, his voice dripping with mock encouragement as his phone captured every moment for his livestream audience. Show us how tough you really are, Mr. Action Hero. The champagne had transformed his natural arrogance into something uglier, a public humiliation designed to feed his ego and entertain his online followers. Comments poured across his screen. Make him dance. Fake tough guy. Ask him about his ponytail. When Seagal still didn't respond, Mansfield decided to escalate. His hand reached out toward the leather-bound copy of the Book of Five Rings, fingers extending to snatch it away in what he imagined would be a moment of triumphant dominance captured forever on social media. Let's see what kind of bedtime stories action stars read these days. The moment Mansfield's fingers made contact with the book, Steven Seagal's eyes snapped open. They weren't angry eyes, or surprised eyes, or even particularly emotional eyes. They were the calm, focused eyes of a predator that had been patiently waiting for its prey to make a fatal mistake. In one fluid motion that happened faster than Mansfield's champagne-clouded reflexes could process, Seagal's left hand moved up and caught the billionaire's wrist in what appeared to be a gentle, almost casual grip, but the effect was immediate and devastating. Mansfield's face contorted as if he'd grabbed a live electrical wire. The pressure on specific nerve points sent shooting pain up his arm, while the grip strength, impossible for a man of any age, let alone 73, made it feel like. His wrist was caught in a hydraulic press. He couldn't move his hand forward, backward, or to either side. He was completely trapped by what looked like nothing more than a polite handshake. "I suggest you return to your seat, sir," Seagal said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of absolute authority that comes from decades of knowing exactly how much damage you're capable of inflicting. The words were spoken softly, almost conversationally, but they cut through the cabin noise like a blade. Other passengers stopped their conversations to stare at the strange tableau. A billionaire tech mogul frozen in obvious pain by an elderly man who hadn't even bothered to close his book. Mansfield tried to pull away, his face reddening with effort and embarrassment. The grip didn't budge. If anything, the pressure seemed to increase slightly, sending new waves of agony through nerve pathways he'd never known existed. His phone clattered to the floor as his fingers went numb. "Please," he gasped, the word torn from his throat by pain and the sudden, terrifying realization that he was completely helpless. Ruth Kowalski leaned forward in her seat, a satisfied smile creasing her weathered features. This was what happened when punks picked on the wrong people. Her late husband would have loved this moment. Marcus Stone, the ex-Marine bodyguard, took a half-step forward, then stopped as his professional instincts kicked in. He'd seen enough real violence to recognize when someone was completely outclassed. Whatever this quiet passenger was, he wasn't just some aging actor. As suddenly as it had begun, the demonstration ended. Seagal released Mansfield's wrist with the same casual precision he'd used to capture it, his attention already returning to his book as if nothing of consequence had occurred. Mansfield stumbled backward, cradling his hand against his chest. Red marks showed clearly where those impossibly strong fingers had gripped him, and his wrist throbbed with residual pain. The smug confidence that had carried him through the confrontation had evaporated completely, replaced by a cold understanding that he'd just made a very serious mistake. Derek Paulson and Casey Wright stared at their boss in shock, watching their invincible employer reduced to a stammering wreck by what had appeared to be gentle contact. The live stream continued broadcasting, but now the comments had changed. "Holy shit, did you see that? That guy's no joke. Mansfield just got owned." Flight attendant Linda Chen approached with renewed urgency, but the crisis seemed to have resolved itself. The billionaire was returning to his seat without further prompting, no longer interested in celebrity harassment or social media content. Mansfield collapsed into 1A, his hands still shaking and his wrist bearing the clear imprint of fingers that had felt like steel cables. One thought echoed through his champagne-fogged mind. What the hell did I just do? Back in seat 1A, Bradley Mansfield tried desperately to salvage what remained of his dignity. His hand trembled as he reached for his champagne flute, the red marks on his wrist clearly visible to anyone who cared to look. Derek and Casey exchanged nervous glances, suddenly uncertain about their employer's invincibility. Technical difficulties with the live stream. Mansfield muttered to his phone, ending the broadcast that had captured his humiliation for thousands of viewers. "We'll resume later." But his bravado had cracked, and everyone could see it. Marcus Stone studied his employer with new eyes, recognizing the look of someone who'd just discovered they weren't the apex predator they'd imagined themselves to be. Across the aisle, Steven Seagal had returned to his meditation, but now he was covertly observing Mansfield through peripheral vision. The billionaire's behavior patterns, the constant phone checking, the nervous adjustments of his briefcase, the way he unconsciously touched the titanium case every few minutes, painted a picture of a man carrying something far more dangerous than corporate secrets. Seagal activated a specialized app on his encrypted federal phone, using the cabin's ambient lighting to photograph Mansfield's briefcase from multiple angles. The high-resolution images were immediately processed through FBI facial recognition and financial tracking algorithms, cross-referenced against international criminal databases. The results confirmed his worst suspicions that CyberVault Technologies had been selling military-grade encryption software to shell companies linked to organized crime for the past 18 months. The financial records showed a pattern of cryptocurrency transactions that matched known arms dealing operations, payments. Structured to avoid detection by traditional banking oversight, Bradley Mansfield wasn't just an obnoxious passenger. He was the technological linchpin in Viktor Kozlov's weapons trafficking network. As Seagal's fingers moved silently across his phone's keyboard, sending encrypted updates to Agent Martinez through the aircraft's satellite internet connection. The message was brief but urgent. Target confirmed aboard flight. Briefcase likely contains encryption keys for Kozlov operation. Maintaining surveillance. Meanwhile, Mansfield's paranoia was reaching new levels. He kept glancing at Seagal, clearly rattled by their encounter, but unable to shake the feeling that he was missing something important. The grip strength had been inhuman, far beyond what any 73-year-old should possess, actor or not. "Derek," he whispered urgently to his assistant, "run a background check on that passenger. Steven Seagal. I want to know everything. Recent movies, public appearances, where he's been living." Derek nodded and began typing frantically on his tablet, pulling up entertainment industry databases and celebrity tracking websites. What he found only deepened the mystery. Seagal had been virtually invisible for the past 5 years, with no confirmed public appearances or film projects. During a bathroom break, Ruth Kowalski approached Seagal's seat with the careful deliberation of someone who'd spent 40 years reading people's character. "That was beautiful," she whispered, her Brooklyn accent adding steel to the words. "My husband would have loved seeing that punk put in his place. Most people just let bullies run wild these days." Seagal looked up from his book, his dark eyes meeting hers with genuine warmth. "Your husband sounds like a good man, ma'am. The best. Korean War, 3 Purple Hearts. He always said you could tell a man's character by how he treated people who couldn't fight back." She glanced toward Mansfield's seat with obvious disgust. "That one's got no character at all." As Ruth returned to her seat, Seagal noticed 4 men in coach class who'd been making subtle eye contact with each other throughout the flight. Professional surveillance pattern. The pieces were falling into place, and none of them were good. 2 hours into the 14-hour flight, Captain William Torres's voice crackled over the intercom with the practiced calm of a 25-year aviation veteran. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unexpected turbulence ahead. Please, return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts while we navigate through this weather system." But Steven Seagal knew immediately that something was wrong. The plane's movement patterns didn't match natural atmospheric disturbance. The subtle course corrections were too precise, too deliberate. Someone was controlling their aircraft remotely. His suspicions crystallized when he discreetly accessed the plane's navigation system using his federal override codes. The autopilot had been compromised by an external signal, slowly but steadily diverting Flight 447 from its planned route over the Pacific. They were being electronically hijacked, and most of the passengers had no idea their lives were now in mortal danger. Seagal's trained eyes swept the cabin, cataloging potential threats. The 4 men he'd noticed earlier were now moving with purpose, advancing from coach class in carefully timed intervals. They moved like professionals, never more than 1 at a time, timing their movements between flight attendant safety checks. Maintaining the illusion of normal passenger behavior, he palmed a ceramic butter knife from his meal tray, the blade sharp enough to penetrate flesh but invisible to metal detectors. His seatbelt loosened with practiced efficiency, preparing for immediate action while maintaining the appearance of a relaxed passenger. Bradley Mansfield noticed Seagal's sudden alertness and followed his gaze toward the advancing figures. The billionaire's face went pale as recognition dawned in his eyes, not of the individuals, but of what their presence meant. "Oh God," Mansfield whispered, his voice barely audible above the cabin noise. "They're not supposed to be here yet." The admission confirmed what Seagal already suspected. Mansfield knew these men, and their early arrival had disrupted whatever plan the billionaire thought he was part of. The titanium briefcase suddenly felt heavier against Mansfield's wrist, its contents now representing not just illegal profits, but immediate danger to everyone aboard. Ruth Kowalski sensed the tension building and instinctively gathered her belongings closer. 40 years of teaching in tough Brooklyn neighborhoods had given her an almost supernatural ability to detect approaching violence. Jennifer Hayes noticed the elderly woman's alertness and clutched baby Emma protectively, Maternal instincts screaming warnings she couldn't yet understand. Flight attendant Linda Chun was conducting her routine safety check when the first of the four men reached the first-class cabin boundary. Something in his eyes, cold, professional, utterly without mercy, made her pause mid-sentence. The cabin lights suddenly dimmed to their lowest setting, casting long shadows across the leather seats and creating perfect cover for what was about to unfold. Emergency lighting strips along the floor provided the only illumination, giving the luxurious cabin an ominous, underwater quality. Seagal's breathing shifted to the controlled rhythm he'd learned decades ago in Navy SEAL training, deep, measured breaths that would flood his system with oxygen and prepare his body for explosive violence. His meditation wasn't just spiritual practice. It was combat preparation. The first masked figure appeared at the cabin door, weapon drawn and face covered by a black ski mask. Professional-grade Glock 19, held with the confidence of someone who'd used it before. Behind him, three more shadows. Moved with military precision, the Mansfield's hands began to shake as the reality of his situation crystallized. Whatever protection he'd been promised, whatever deal he thought he'd made, it was about to be tested in the most brutal way possible. The hijacking of Flight 447 had begun, and 200 innocent lives now hung in the balance between a billionaire's greed and a federal agent's determination to protect them. The takeover happened with military precision that spoke of extensive planning and professional training. Lead hijacker Dmitry Volkov moved through the first-class cabin like a predator claiming new territory. His Glock 19 trained on the terrified passengers while his three associates, Alexei Petrov, Igor Semenov, and Yuri Morozov, secured strategic positions throughout the compartment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dmitry announced in accented English, his voice carrying the cold authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Remain calm, and you will not be harmed. This aircraft is now under our control." At 32, Dmitry possessed the powerfully built frame of a heavyweight boxer, with distinctive Spetsnaz tattoos marking his forearms, symbols of Russia's most elite special forces unit. His blue eyes swept the cabin with professional assessment, cataloging threats and potential resistance with the methodical efficiency of a career soldier. Flight attendants Linda Chun, Robert Kim, and Patricia Valdez were forced to the front of the cabin at gunpoint, their professional training utterly inadequate for this nightmare scenario. Passengers screamed and ducked behind their seats, except for Ruth Kowalski, who remained upright and glared at the gunman with Brooklyn defiance that had faced down worse threats than Russian criminals. Jennifer Hayes clutched baby Emma protectively, her maternal instincts overriding her terror as she shielded her daughter from the violence erupting around them. The infant remained mercifully asleep, unaware that her young life now hung in the balance. But it was Bradley Mansfield's reaction that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. Instead of showing surprise or outrage, the billionaire immediately raised his hands and shouted desperately, "Don't shoot. I'm Bradley Mansfield. You know who I am. We have a deal." The admission sent shockwaves through the other passengers. Ruth Kowalski's expression shifted from defiance to disgust as she realized they'd been betrayed by one of their own. Jennifer's eyes widened with the horrible understanding that this wasn't a random hijacking. It was a planned operation, and the man she'd watched humiliate an elderly passenger was somehow involved. Dmitry smiled coldly, his weapon never wavering as he studied the cowering billionaire. "Yes, Mr. Mansfield, we know exactly who you are. You have something that belongs to my father." The reference to Viktor Kozlov confirmed Steven Seagal's worst fears. This wasn't just armed robbery or terrorism. It was the culmination of an international criminal conspiracy worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The briefcase handcuffed to Mansfield's wrist contained the keys to one of the largest arms deals in recent history. Seagal remained perfectly motionless in seat 3A, his copy of the Book of Five Rings still open in his hands, but his mind was racing through tactical calculations. For armed men, professional-grade weapons, unknown explosives capability, civilian hostages including an infant and elderly passengers, confined space with limited maneuverability. The variables were challenging, but not impossible. Alexei Petrov, a lean man with the nervous energy of someone addicted to violence, gestured with his weapon toward the terrified flight attendants. Igor Semenov, built like a wrestler with a face that had seen too many fights, positioned himself to cover the cabin's rear exit. Yuri Morozov, youngest of the group at perhaps 25, watched the passengers with the eager anticipation of someone hoping for resistance. "The briefcase, Mr. Mansfield," Dmitri continued, his voice carrying the patient menace of someone who enjoyed psychological intimidation. "My father is waiting for his merchandise, and you are going to help us complete this transaction." Mansfield's hands shook as he fumbled with the titanium case. His earlier arrogance completely evaporated in the face of real violence. "Of course, yes, whatever you need." But the plan was to wait until Tokyo. "Plans change," Dmitri cut him off sharply. "My father decided to accelerate the timeline." "Open it." When Bradley Mansfield hesitated to unlock his briefcase, his hands trembling with terror and confusion, Dmitri Volkov's patience evaporated. The Russian's cold blue eyes assessed the situation with predatory calculation before he gestured to Alexei Petrov. "Grab the baby," Dmitri ordered in heavily accented English. "Mr. Mansfield needs proper motivation to cooperate." Alexei moved toward Jennifer Hayes with the casual brutality of someone who viewed civilians as disposable tools. Jennifer clutched baby Emma tighter, backing against the window as the armed man approached with obvious intent to use her infant daughter as leverage against a billionaire's compliance. That was when Steven Seagal decided the talking was over, rising from seat 3A with fluid grace that defied his 73 years. Seagal moved between Alexei and the terrified mother with the calm precision of a man who'd spent decades perfecting the art of controlled violence. His weathered hands remained visible, his posture non-threatening, but something in his movement made every hijacker suddenly reassess their tactical situation. "Federal agent," he announced quietly, producing his badge with deliberate slowness while keeping his eyes locked on Dmitri. "Let's discuss this professionally." Dmitri's laugh was harsh and mocking, but his grip on his Glock tightened imperceptibly. "Action movie star thinks he's a real cop? Very amusing, old man." "Step aside before." He never finished the sentence. When Alexei tried to push past Seagal to reach baby Emma, the Aikido master demonstrated why legends are born from reality, not Hollywood fantasy. In 3 seconds of explosive violence that seemed to unfold in slow motion, Seagal's ridge hand strike crushed Alexei's larynx with surgical precision, cutting off the Russian's scream before it could begin. The follow-up was devastating poetry. In motion, Seagal's elbow drove upward into Igor Semenov's nose and cheekbone, shattering bone with an audible crack that echoed through the cabin. Before Igor's body could hit the floor, the federal agent's left hand had already captured Yuri Morozov's gun arm in a lightning-fast wrist control technique that hyperextended the elbow joint beyond its breaking point. The sound of Yuri's ulna snapping was clearly audible to every passenger. 3 armed hijackers lay groaning on the cabin floor, completely neutralized by someone the passengers had dismissed as a washed-up actor. Alexei clutched his throat, gasping for air through his crushed windpipe. Igor was unconscious, blood streaming from his shattered facial bones. Yuri cradled his broken arm, whimpering in Russian. The entire engagement had lasted exactly 12 seconds. Passengers stared in stunned silence as the quiet man they'd watched being humiliated by a billionaire revealed himself as one of the most dangerous individuals on the aircraft. Ruth Kowalski's eyes shone with vindicated satisfaction. She'd known there was something special about the stranger from the moment he'd put Mansfield in his place. Bradley Mansfield's mouth hung open as the full scope of his earlier mistake became crystal clear. He'd spent 2 hours mocking and filming a federal agent capable of killing him with a casual gesture. The grip strength that had trapped his wrist now made perfect sense. Those weren't the hands of an aging actor, but of a professional warrior who'd maintained his deadly skills through decades of real combat. Jennifer Hayes clutched baby Emma tighter, tears of relief streaming down her face as she realized the quiet passenger had just saved her daughter's life without hesitation or fanfare. But Dmitri Volkov was far from finished. The surviving hijacker pressed his Glock directly against Seagal's temple, his voice tight with rage and desperation. "Very impressive, Agent Sullivan. But now you've made this personal." The cold steel of Dmitri Volkov's Glock pressed against Steven Seagal's temple, but the federal agent's breathing remained steady and controlled. Three hijackers lay groaning on the cabin floor, testament to what happened when professionals underestimated their opposition, but Dmitri had quickly adapted to the new tactical reality. "Drop any weapons you're carrying, Agent Sullivan," Dmitri commanded, his Russian accent thickening with stress and fury. "Or I start executing hostages, beginning with the old woman." He gestured toward Ruth Kowalski with his free hand, and Igor Semenov, despite his shattered nose and blood-streaked face, struggled to his feet and pressed his backup pistol against the elderly woman's temple. Ruth's Brooklyn-hardened glare never wavered, but Jennifer Hayes gasped in horror as baby Emma began crying. Sensing the tension that filled the cabin like toxic gas, Seagal calculated angles and distances with the precision of a master tactician. But even his legendary skills couldn't overcome the basic mathematics of hostage situations. Too many innocent lives, too many guns, too little room for error. He slowly reached into his jacket and withdrew the ceramic knife he'd palmed from his meal service, placing it on the floor and kicking it toward Dmitri's feet. But as he bent forward, his fingers closed around a small titanium object from his pocket, a tactical pen disguised as ordinary writing instrument, virtually undetectable and potentially lethal in trained hands. "Excellent," Dmitri said, his confidence returning as he established control over the situation. "Now everyone will remain calm while we conduct our business with Mr. Mansfield." Alexei Petrov lay unconscious and possibly dying from his crushed larynx, his breathing shallow and labored. Yuri Morozov cradled his broken arm against his chest, tears streaming down his young face as shock and pain overwhelmed his training. The cabin that had been filled with casual conversation and clinking champagne glasses now reeked of blood and terror. Dmitri pulled out a satellite phone and spoke rapidly in Russian, reporting the situation to someone he addressed as Papa, clearly. Viktor Kozlov himself. The conversation revealed that Seagal's intervention had disrupted their carefully planned timeline, but not their ultimate objective. "He says to continue as planned," Dmitri announced after ending the call. "My father is patient and Agent Sullivan's heroics have only delayed the inevitable." Bradley Mansfield, his earlier arrogance completely shattered, watched the exchange with growing horror as he realized the true scope of what he'd become involved in. The briefcase handcuffed to his wrist felt heavier with each passing moment, its contents representing not just illegal profits, but the deaths of everyone aboard Flight 447. "Please," Mansfield whispered, his voice cracking with desperation. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt. This was supposed to be simple, just moving money, nothing more." Ruth Kowalski, despite having a gun pressed to her head, found the strength to speak with the moral authority that had commanded respect in Brooklyn classrooms for 4 decades. "Simple," she said, her voice cutting through the cabin's tense silence. "You sold us all out, you coward. Whatever happens next, their blood is on your hands." Her words hit Mansfield like physical blows, forcing him to confront the reality that his greed had transformed him from successful businessman into accessory to mass murder. The plane continued its electronically hijacked course toward an uncertain destination. While 200 innocent lives hung in the balance between one man's corruption and another's determination to protect them, Dmitri Volkov's revelation of their true destination sent waves of terror through the first-class cabin. Speaking with the cold precision of someone delivering a business presentation, he outlined the scope of Viktor Kozlov's criminal empire while keeping his Glock trained on Steven Seagal's head. "We are proceeding to a private airstrip in rural Alaska," Dmitri announced, his English crisp despite the accent. "My father waits there with $500 million worth of stolen American military equipment, drones capable of carrying chemical weapons, shoulder-fired missiles that can bring down passenger aircraft, communication systems that will allow terrorist cells to coordinate attacks across your country." Jennifer Hayes pressed baby Emma closer to her chest, the infant's soft breathing a stark contrast to the harsh reality being described around her. Ruth Kowalski's face had gone pale, but her Brooklyn-bred defiance remained unshaken even with Igor's gun against her temple. "The Japanese Yakuza have already transferred the cryptocurrency payment," Dmitri continued, checking his watch with the nervous energy of someone operating under a tight deadline. "But the transaction cannot be completed without the quantum Encryption keys in Mr. Mansfield's briefcase. Those codes will make the payment completely untraceable, allowing my father to expand his operations across 3 continents. Bradley Mansfield fumbled with the titanium case, his hands shaking so violently he could barely work the combination locks. Inside, sophisticated computer equipment nestled alongside stacks of bearer bonds worth millions, insurance policies. In case the electronic transfer failed. I thought we were just facilitating refugee assistance, Mansfield said weakly, his voice barely audible. Political dissidents, people escaping oppression. Dimitri's laugh was harsh and mocking. Americans are so naive. Your refugees are buying weapons to kill American soldiers in Syria, Afghanistan, wherever your military ventures next. But you never asked too many questions, did you, Mr. Mansfield? As long as the money kept flowing into your accounts. Captain William Torres's voice crackled over the intercom, strain evident despite his professional training. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing navigational difficulties and will be making an emergency landing at an alternate location. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and seats are in the upright position. The announcement confirmed what Seagal already knew. Their electronic hijacking had been detected by air traffic control, but Victor's people had infiltrated the system deeply enough to maintain control. F-16 fighters would be scrambled within hours, but the remote Alaskan location had been chosen specifically to avoid military interception. My father's people eliminated the ground crew 12 hours ago, Dimitri explained with casual brutality. Air traffic controllers, security personnel, maintenance workers, all dead. We now control the airstrip completely, but we have perhaps 4 hours before American military forces arrive in sufficient numbers to threaten the operation. Seagal processed the tactical information while maintaining his facade of helpless compliance. For hours meant Victor was confident in his ability to complete the transaction and escape before facing serious opposition. The arms dealer had planned this operation with the thoroughness of a military campaign. What about the innocent people on this plane? Jennifer Hayes found the courage to ask, her voice strong despite her terror, Dimitri's cold blue eyes fixed on her with reptilian indifference. Witnesses are a luxury we cannot afford, Mrs. Hayes. Once the transaction is complete, Flight 447 will suffer a tragic mechanical failure over the Alaskan wilderness. No survivors, no evidence, no connection to my father's organization. The casual announcement of mass murder sent shockwaves through the cabin. Ruth Kowalski's expression hardened into something that would have made her late husband proud, while Jennifer clutched her baby with renewed desperation. Mansfield stared at Dimitri in horror, finally understanding that his dreams of easy money had transformed him into an accessory to the murder of 200 innocent people, including a 6-month-old baby whose only crime was being aboard the wrong flight. The weight of imminent death settled over the first-class cabin like a suffocating blanket. But it also created an unexpected bond between the most unlikely allies. Forced to sit together under the watchful eyes of their captors, Steven Seagal and Bradley Mansfield found themselves engaged in their first honest conversation since the flight began. Mansfield's earlier arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by genuine terror and something that might have been remorse. His hands still shook from their encounter hours earlier, but now the trembling came from fear rather than pain. I never meant for this to happen, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Above the aircraft's engines. When Victor first approached me, he presented it as helping political refugees escape oppression. The encryption software was supposed to protect dissidents from authoritarian governments. Seagal's dark eyes studied the younger man with the measured assessment of someone who'd spent decades reading human nature. Greed makes people blind to consequences, Mr. Mansfield. Those refugees, you're helping sell weapons that will kill American soldiers, innocent civilians, children like the baby on this plane. The words hit Mansfield like physical blows, forcing him to confront the reality of what his technology had enabled. Tears began streaming down his face as the full scope of his moral failure crystallized in his mind. Victor has been blackmailing me for months, he admitted, his voice cracking with shame. Tax evasion, illegal campaign contributions, securities fraud, crimes that would destroy my company and send me to federal prison. I thought I could pay him off, make it all go away with money. And now, Seagal asked quietly. Now I realize that money can't buy back your soul. Mansfield replied, wiping his eyes with trembling fingers. I chose profit over principles, and now 200 innocent people are going to die because of my cowardice. Ruth Kowalski, despite having Igor's gun pressed against her temple, managed to speak with the moral authority that had commanded respect in Brooklyn classrooms for 40 years. My husband fought in Korea, she said, her voice strong and clear. He always told me that a man's worth isn't measured by his mistakes, but by what he does to fix them when he gets the chance. Her words seemed to strengthen something in Mansfield's spine, a resolve that had been buried under years of corporate corruption and moral compromise. For the first time since boarding Flight 447, he looked like someone capable of making the right choice. What can I do? He asked Seagal directly. How can I help save these people? Seagal leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely a whisper as he began outlining a desperate plan. You mentioned pilot training earlier. How extensive is your experience? I've been flying since I was 16, Mansfield replied. My grandfather was a World War II ace, flew P-51 Mustangs over Europe. He taught me on vintage warboards before I moved to civilian aircraft. I'm certified for everything from single-engine props to business jets, but not 747s. No, but the principles are similar. What? Before Seagal could answer, Igor Semenov groaned and shifted position, blood still streaming from his shattered nose. The wounded hijacker was arguing with Dmitri in rapid Russian, and from the few words Seagal could understand, Igor wanted to execute all the witnesses immediately. Dmitri's response was sharp and commanding, clearly overruling his subordinates. Bloodthirsty suggestions. But the exchange revealed growing tension within the hijacker team. Violence and time pressure were creating cracks in their professional discipline. Because, Seagal whispered to Mansfield, I have a feeling we're going to need every skill we can get to survive the next few hours. The plan forming in the federal agent's mind was desperate and dangerous, but it was beginning to look like their only chance of saving innocent lives and stopping Viktor Kozlov's criminal empire from claiming its next victims. While Dmitri coordinated with his father via satellite phone, Steven Seagal began implementing the first phase of his counterattack using the psychological warfare tactics he'd learned during his federal training. The key was to plant seeds of doubt and paranoia among the hijackers while maintaining his facade of helpless compliance. During an escorted bathroom break with the wounded Yuri Morozov, Seagal used his titanium tactical pen to puncture a hydraulic line hidden behind the lavatory's maintenance panel. The damage was subtle but deliberate, creating a slow leak that would gradually affect the aircraft's control systems, buying precious time before they reached Victor's Alaskan stronghold. While working, he scratched coordinates into the mirror. Using the pen's tungsten carbide tip, his backup extraction team's frequency and emergency rally point. If any federal agents survived long enough to find the message, they'd know where to send reinforcements. Returning to the cabin under Yuri's increasingly unsteady guard, the young Russian was clearly struggling with blood loss and shock from his broken arm. Seagal began the psychological phase of his assault. Your father's using you as expendable muscle, he said quietly to Dmitri, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone stating obvious facts. Standard operating procedure for crime bosses who don't trust family members to survive capture. Dmitri's blue eyes flashed with anger, but Seagal noticed the slight hesitation, the moment of doubt that suggested his words had found their target. Victor keeps himself safe on the ground while sending his son into the most dangerous part of the operation, Seagal continued, his tone conversational and reasonable. If this mission fails, who faces American federal prosecutors? You. Who? Disappears into witness protection or a shallow grave. You. Your father remains untouchable, ready to sacrifice his own blood for another 10% profit margin. Shut up, Dmitri snarled. But the psychological damage was already spreading. Crime families operated on paranoia and mistrust, and Seagal was exploiting those fundamental weaknesses with surgical precision. When Yuri collapsed from blood loss, his broken arm finally overwhelming his ability to function, Dmitri was forced to allow flight attendant Linda Chun to provide medical assistance. The distraction gave Seagal the opportunity to implement the next phase of his plan, working with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd spent years preparing for exactly this scenario. He began loosening seat bolts and armrest fixtures using his titanium pen as an improvised tool. Each loosened component became a potential weapon or obstacle. Chair legs that could be detached for clubs, metal brackets that could serve as throwing weapons, anything that might tip the odds in favor of innocent people fighting for their lives. Ruth Kowalski watched his subtle movements with the keen intelligence of someone who'd spent decades managing difficult situations. She understood immediately what the federal agent was preparing for and began positioning herself to help when the moment came. Meanwhile, Bradley Mansfield was undergoing his own transformation. Watching Seagal's methodical preparations for violence had crystallized something in the billionaire's character, a recognition that money and technology meant nothing in the face of genuine evil. For the first time in years, he was thinking about someone other than himself. The plane's hydraulic warning light flickered on in the cockpit, and Captain Torres reported minor mechanical issues over the radio, the first sign that Seagal's sabotage was beginning to affect their flight systems. Dmitri noticed the change in cabin atmosphere, the subtle shift from terrorized compliance to something more dangerous. His three-man team was reduced to himself and two wounded subordinates, facing passengers who were beginning to look less like helpless victims and more like people with nothing left to lose. The federal agent's psychological warfare was working exactly as intended, creating doubt, paranoia, and desperation among the hijackers while inspiring courage and determination among the innocent people whose lives hung in the balance point 2 hours into the hijacking. The toxic atmosphere aboard Flight 447 reached a critical breaking point. Alexei Petrov had died from his crushed larynx, his body covered with an airline blanket in the galley area, sending Dmitry Volkov into a rage that transformed calculated professionalism into something far more dangerous. Justice, Dmitry snarled, pressing his Glock harder against Steven Seagal's temple. You killed my man, Agent Sullivan. Now you face the consequences. But Ruth Kowalski had endured enough. Rising from her seat with the moral authority that had commanded respect in Brooklyn's toughest classrooms for 4 decades, she faced down the armed Russian with fearless defiance. Justice? She scoffed, her voice cutting through the cabin's tense silence like a blade. Your friend was about to hurt a baby. This man stopped him. That's not murder, son. That's heroism. Dmitri whirled toward her, his weapon wavering between Seagal and the elderly woman who dared challenge his authority. Sit down, old woman, before you what? Ruth interrupted, stepping closer despite Igor's gun trained on her from across the aisle. You think I'm afraid of some Russian punk? My husband died fighting for this country. My son served 3 tours in Afghanistan, and my grandson is a Marine stationed in Okinawa. You think I haven't buried better men than you? Her words electrified the cabin. Jennifer Hayes, drawing strength from the elderly woman's courage, clutched baby Emma tighter and glared at Dmitri with maternal fury that transcended fear. Businessman Frank Novak, previously cowering in seat 2B, quietly loosened his seatbelt and began assessing potential weapons. Within reach, Bradley Mansfield felt the transformation most acutely. Watching this 78-year-old woman stand up to armed terrorists while he had spent hours mocking an elderly passenger made him realize how far he'd fallen from the values his grandfather had tried to instill in him. She's right, Mansfield said, standing up despite Dimitri's weapon turning toward him. Leave her alone. Your problem is with me and my briefcase, not these innocent people. For the first time since the hijacking began, passengers were showing unified resistance instead of cowering in terrorized isolation. The psychological shift was palpable, from helpless victims to people willing to fight for their lives and principles. Dmitri, frustrated by the erosion of his control and pushed beyond rational thinking by his subordinate's death, made a critical, tactical error. Raising his pistol, he struck Ruth across the forehead with the weapon's grip, opening a cut that immediately began bleeding down her weathered face. The violent assault on an elderly woman crossed a line that galvanized everyone. In the cabin, Jennifer's maternal instincts flared into protective rage. Frank Novak's hands clenched into fists despite his lack of combat training. Even the flight attendants shifted from terrified compliance to barely contained anger, but it was Steven Seagal's reaction that mattered most. His expression didn't change, no anger, no visible emotion, but his breathing shifted to the deep, controlled rhythm that preceded explosive violence. The psychological assessment was complete. These weren't soldiers following orders. They were criminals who enjoyed inflicting pain on innocent people. "You just made this personal," Seagal said quietly, his voice carrying the same deadly calm he'd used with Mansfield hours earlier. Dmitri sneered, unaware that he'd just signed his own death warrant by crossing the line from necessary violence to sadistic cruelty. The moment Dmitri raised his gun to execute Ruth Kowalski as an example to the other passengers, Steven Seagal exploded into action with the devastating precision that had made him legendary. His movement was so fluid and sudden that it seemed to bend the laws of physics. One instant, he was sitting motionless. The next, he was a force of nature unleashing controlled destruction. His first strike targeted Igor Semenov's gun hand with a shudo, a knife hand technique that shattered the radius and ulna bones in the Russian's wrist with surgical precision. Igor's weapon went flying across the cabin as he screamed in agony, his arm hanging at an impossible angle. Without pausing, Seagal flowed into a classic Aikido irimi, entering directly into Dmitri's personal space while simultaneously redirecting the hijacker's gun away from Ruth with a wrist control technique that hyperextended the elbow joint beyond its breaking point. The sound of ligaments tearing was audible throughout the first-class cabin that Dmitri's Glock clattered to the floor as his arm bent backward at an anatomically impossible angle. His scream of pain and rage filled the air, but Seagal wasn't finished. A precise strike to the carotid artery rendered Igor unconscious before his broken body could hit the cabin floor. Yuri Morozov, despite his earlier injuries and blood loss, attempted to intervene with his backup weapon. But his movements were slow and uncoordinated from shock and pain, making him easy prey for Seagal's devastating foot sweep. The young Russian crashed into the galley area with bone-jarring force, his head striking a metal service cart with a sickening thud. The entire engagement lasted exactly 12 seconds. Passengers erupted in cheers as Seagal secured the scattered weapons, but their celebration was premature. Dmitri, his dominant arm hanging useless and his face contorted with pain, managed to activate a device with his functioning hand, a dead man's switch connected to plastic explosives hidden throughout the cabin. "Clever, Agent Sullivan," he gasped, through gritted teeth, his Russian accent thickening with stress and agony. "But we all die together now. This switch requires constant pressure. If I lose consciousness or die, we have 30 seconds before the explosives detonate." The revelation sent ice through everyone's veins. Seagal had won the tactical engagement, but his victory had created an even deadlier problem. The hijacker was now a living bomb, and keeping him alive and conscious had become essential for everyone's survival. "Why?" Ruth Kowalski asked, dabbing blood from her forehead with a tissue. "Why kill innocent people for money?" Dmitri's laugh was bitter and filled with pain. "You think this is about money, old woman? This is about power. My father controls governments, armies, the fate of nations. Your American democracy is just another commodity to be bought and sold." Captain Torres's voice crackled over the intercom with barely controlled panic. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have multiple system failures. I need everyone to prepare for an emergency landing. We're losing altitude and may have to attempt a water landing in the Pacific." The hydraulic damage from Seagal's earlier sabotage was now cascading through the aircraft's control systems, creating a crisis that threatened to kill everyone aboard regardless of Dmitri's explosives, Seagal realized with cold clarity that they now faced a three-part nightmare. A wounded hijacker holding a dead man's switch, a crippled aircraft losing altitude over the Pacific Ocean, and 200 innocent lives hanging in the balance of decisions that would have to be made in the next few minutes. The battle for Flight 447 was far from over, with Dmitri clutching the explosive trigger and his arm shattered beyond use. The situation aboard Flight 447 transformed into a tense standoff that required impossible cooperation between mortal enemies. Steven Seagal found himself in the surreal position of needing to keep the hijacker alive and conscious while dealing with the aircraft's rapidly deteriorating condition. "How long do we have?" Seagal asked, kneeling beside Dmitri with medical supplies from the first aid kit. 30 seconds after I release pressure," Dmitri replied through gritted teeth, sweat beading on his forehead from pain and shock. "The explosives are wired throughout the cabin. You'll never find them all in time. Captain Torres's voiceover. The intercom grew increasingly urgent. We're losing hydraulic pressure on multiple systems. I may not be able to maintain controlled flight much longer. Everyone needs to prepare for emergency crash procedures. But Seagal's federal medical training kicked in as he began setting Dimitri's compound fracture using improvised splints from seat components and safety straps. The irony wasn't lost on him, saving the life of a man who'd threatened to murder 200 innocent people. "Why are you helping me?" Dimitri asked, his voice weak but suspicious. "Because those people don't deserve to die for your father's greed," Seagal replied, securing the splint with methodical precision. "And because maybe you're starting to understand that yourself." The act of mercy was having its intended effect. Dimitri's resolve was cracking as he watched the federal agent risk his own life to provide medical care to someone who'd tried to kill him moments earlier. The contrast between Seagal's principled behavior and Victor's ruthless exploitation of his own son was becoming impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Bradley Mansfield was discovering courage he'd never known he possessed. Working with Captain Torres through the intercom, he used his extensive pilot training to help stabilize the aircraft's failing systems. His technical expertise with computer systems proved invaluable in rerouting backup controls around damaged hydraulic lines. "I've never attempted an emergency landing in a 747, Torres admitted over the radio. "I need all the help I can get. My grandfather flew P-51s in World War II, Mansfield replied, his hands steady on improvised control interfaces. "He always said that any landing you walk away from is a good landing. We're going to walk away from this one." Ruth Kowalski, despite her head injury, organized the other passengers in preparing for potential crash landing. Her decades of classroom management experience proved invaluable in keeping terrified people focused on survival procedures rather than panic. Jennifer Hayes, inspired by everyone's determination to fight for their lives, volunteered to help with first aid despite having an infant to protect. "If we're going down, at least we're going down fighting," she said, her voice strong despite her fear. The aircraft situation continued to deteriorate, but the psychological dynamic had shifted completely. Instead of helpless victims waiting for death, the passengers had become a unified team working together for survival. That's when Viktor Kozlov's voice crackled over the radio, transmitted through the aircraft's emergency communication system. His cultured Russian accent carried across the cabin with chilling clarity. "Dimitri, you have failed me. Complete the mission or do not come home." The transmission revealed Victor's complete willingness to sacrifice his own son for the success of his criminal enterprise. Dimitri's face went pale as he finally understood what Seagal had been trying to tell him. His father valued the arms deal more than his only child's life. 23 years old, Dimitri whispered, staring at the dead man's switch in his trembling hand. "And my father treats me like a business expense." Viktor Kozlov's cold dismissal of his wounded son over the radio shattered the last vestiges of Dimitri's filial loyalty. The young Russian stared at the dead man's switch with new understanding, finally seeing his father's criminal empire for what it truly was, a machine that consumed everything in its path, including family. "He doesn't care if I live or die," Dimitri whispered to Steven Seagal, his voice hollow with the pain of ultimate betrayal. 23 years of trying to earn his approval, and I'm just another expendable asset." Seagal recognized the opportunity and pressed his psychological advantage. "Help me save these people, and you can start building something better than what he gave you." Working together with painstaking care, they began the delicate process of disarming the explosives. Dimitri's knowledge of the trigger mechanism combined with Seagal's steady hands and federal training in bomb disposal created their only hope of survival. Each wire had to be traced and disconnected in precise sequence, a process complicated by the aircraft's increasing instability. But even as they worked, Captain Torres delivered devastating news over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, the hydraulic damage is worse than we initially thought. We have maybe 20 minutes of controlled flight remaining. I'm sorry, but I don't know if I can bring us down safely." The admission that their experienced pilot was losing hope sent waves of terror through the cabin. But Bradley Mansfield stepped forward with newfound courage. "Captain, this is Bradley Mansfield in first class. I'm a licensed pilot with 27 years of experience. My grandfather was a World War II ace, and I've been flying since I was 16. I can help you bring us home. Torres's relief was audible in his response. Any assistance would be appreciated, Mr. Mansfield. Can you reach the cockpit? But their cooperation was interrupted by Victor's voice crackling through the radio again, this time carrying a threat. That chilled everyone to the bone. Dmitri, I see you on our radar screens. You have exactly 10 minutes to deliver the briefcase to the landing coordinates, or I will shoot down the aircraft myself. I have surface-to-air missiles positioned around the airstrip. The revelation that Victor was willing to murder his own son and 200 innocent people to protect his criminal empire from exposure sent shockwaves through the cabin. Even Dmitri, who'd grown up in the world of organized crime, looked stunned by his father's complete moral bankruptcy. He's serious, Dmitri said quietly, his face pale with the realization that his father had always been prepared to kill him if necessary. Viktor Kozlov doesn't make empty threats. Jennifer Hayes clutched baby Emma tighter, unable to comprehend the level of evil that would murder an infant to avoid criminal prosecution. Ruth Kowalski's expression hardened into something that would have made her late husband proud. She'd faced down Nazis in her neighborhood during World War II, and she wasn't backing down from Russian criminals now. Then we go to the airstrip, Seagal announced, his decision surprising everyone in the cabin. It's our only chance. In the air, we're sitting ducks for his missiles. On the ground, I can protect you. Captain Torres and Mansfield worked frantically to execute the impossible approach, using the billionaire's extensive flight training to compensate for the 747's failing control systems. Meanwhile, Seagal coordinated passenger safety, positioning everyone for what was likely to be a catastrophic landing followed by immediate combat. We're not going down without a fight, Ruth Kowalski declared, rallying the passengers with the moral authority that had commanded respect for 40 years. We've got a real American hero leading us, and Viktor Kozlov is about to learn why some people are worth more than money. Through the windows, the remote Alaskan airstrip became visible, a desolate facility surrounded by wilderness, with Victor's black vehicles positioned around the runway like pieces on a chessboard. Armed men were clearly visible, along with the distinctive silhouette of military-grade surface-to-air missiles. Here we go, Seagal said quietly, as Flight 447 began its final, desperate approach to what might be everyone's last landing. The emergency landing of Flight 447 was a controlled catastrophe that pushed both aircraft and crew beyond their design limits. Captain Torres and Bradley Mansfield worked in desperate harmony, the experienced airline pilot's steady hands complemented by the billionaire's intimate knowledge of flight dynamics learned from his World War II ace grandfather. Approach speed is way too high, Torres reported through gritted teeth, fighting controls that responded like sluggish nightmares. We're coming in at nearly twice normal landing velocity. My grandfather crash-landed a shot-up Mustang in France. With no hydraulics, Mansfield replied, his hands flying over backup control systems with newfound purpose. He always said the airplane wants to fly. Our job is to convince it to stop flying when we're ready. In the cabin, Steven Seagal had transformed terrified passengers into a coordinated survival unit. Using his federal training in crisis management, he positioned everyone in crash positions while secretly distributing improvised weapons, broken seat components, metal service utensils, anything that could be used in the coming ground battle. Remember, he told them quietly, we're not just fighting for our lives. We're fighting for everyone those weapons would have killed if Victor's deal goes through. Ruth Kowalski rallied the passengers with words that would have made her late husband proud. We've survived the worst these criminals could throw at us up here. Now we show them what Americans do when cornered on our own soil. Dmitry Volkov, his arm in an improvised sling and his loyalty to his father completely shattered, provided crucial intelligence about Victor's ground forces. 12 men with military weapons, he reported, his voice weak but determined. Former Spetsnaz, all of them. But they're expecting cooperation, not resistance. The 747 hit the runway with bone-jarring force, tires exploding from the excessive speed and engines throwing sparks as they scraped against asphalt. Inside the cabin, passengers were thrown against their restraints despite Seagal's crash preparations, but his positioning had minimized serious injuries. Jennifer Hayes protected baby Emma with her own body, drawing strength from seeing everyone else prepare to fight for their lives. The infant remained remarkably calm, as if sensing that the adults around her would die before letting harm come to her. When the aircraft finally skidded to a stop after nearly a mile of controlled destruction, it was immediately surrounded by Victor's forces, 12 men with assault rifles positioned behind concrete barriers and armored vehicles, their movements displaying the disciplined coordination of elite military units. Viktor Kozlov emerged from a black Mercedes, and even at a distance, his bearing commanded attention. Tall and distinguished in his expensive suit, he looked more like a diplomat than an arms dealer, but the cold calculation in his gray eyes revealed his true nature. Speaking through a bullhorn, his cultured voice carried across the airstrip. "My son Dmitri, bring me Agent Sullivan and the briefcase. Do this, and I will allow the other passengers to live." Through the aircraft windows, passengers could see 5 people from the nearby town, including 2 children, bound and kneeling near the runway. Victor's willingness to use innocent locals as leverage demonstrated the complete absence of moral constraints that made him so dangerous. Seagal assessed the tactical situation with professional detachment. Outnumbered, outgunned, trapped in a metal tube with limited exits, facing elite soldiers on open ground. The odds were impossible, but he built a career on making the impossible merely difficult. The view from Flight 447's windows revealed the full scope of Viktor Kozlov's preparation and ruthlessness. The remote Alaskan airstrip had been transformed into a military-style compound, with concrete barriers, armored vehicles, and enough firepower to outfit a small army. But it was the civilian hostages that demonstrated Victor's complete moral bankruptcy. 5 people from the nearby town of Fairbanks, including children no older than 10, bound and forced to kneel in the snow as human shields. "My father never makes empty threats," Dmitri said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 23 years of witnessing Victor's methods. "Those people will die if we don't give him what he wants." Steven Seagal studied the tactical situation through the aircraft's windows, his trained eyes cataloging every detail. Victor's men were positioned with professional competence. Overlapping fields of fire, multiple escape routes covered, elevated positions that maximized their advantages. Former Russian special forces, all of them, equipped with military-grade weapons and the discipline to use them effectively. But Seagal also noticed what Victor's men had missed in their focus on containing the aircraft. The emergency slides could be deployed as improvised cover, creating temporary barriers that would disrupt their carefully planned kill zones. The aviation fuel that had leaked during their crash landing created potential fire hazards that could work in the defenders' favor. Most importantly, the wilderness beyond the airstrip offered escape routes if they could reach it. "We're going out there," Seagal announced, his decision shocking everyone in the cabin. "But not to surrender. We're going to end this." Ruth Kowalski, despite being 78 and injured, immediately volunteered for the most dangerous role. "I've raised 5 kids in Brooklyn and buried a war hero husband," she declared. "I can handle getting scared civilians to safety while you boys handle the shooting." Bradley Mansfield's transformation from selfish billionaire to willing fighter was now complete. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, no trace of his earlier arrogance remaining. "Use your technical expertise to create chaos," Seagal replied. "Every alarm, every emergency system this plane has. I want them all going off at once when we make our move." Jennifer Hayes surprised everyone by refusing evacuation with the noncombatants. "My daughter deserves a world where people like Victor don't get to win," she said, her voice strong despite the tears streaming down her face. "I'm staying to fight." Captain Torres volunteered for what everyone knew was likely a suicide mission, using the aircraft's remaining fuel and hydraulic systems to create explosive diversions that would cover their escape. "I've been responsible for passenger safety for 25 years, he said simply. "That doesn't stop now." Flight attendants Linda Chun, Robert Kim, and Patricia Valdez coordinated passenger safety procedures while preparing to assist with the desperate plan. Their professional training in emergency management proved invaluable in organizing civilians for combat operations they'd never imagined facing. Outside, Victor's patience was wearing thin. His cultured voice carried across the airstrip through his bullhorn. You have 60 seconds to produce my son and Agent Sullivan, or I begin executing hostages. Starting with the children. The threat crystallized everyone's resolve. These weren't just criminals seeking money. They were monsters willing to murder children to protect their profits. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, Viktor Kozlov's evil would not be allowed to triumph. Seagal moved to the emergency exit, his hand on the door release mechanism. Behind him, passengers who'd started the flight as strangers now stood united in their determination to fight against overwhelming odds. Remember, he said, his voice carrying the calm authority that had sustained him through decades of real combat. We're not just fighting for our lives. We're fighting for the idea that evil doesn't get to win just because it has more guns. The battle for Flight 447 was about to move to its final, most dangerous phase. Steven Seagal's plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal, but it was their only chance against Viktor Kozlov's overwhelming firepower. As he outlined a strategy to his unlikely team of civilian fighters, each person understood they were committing to a battle where survival was far from guaranteed. Bradley, you're our chaos generator, Seagal said, reviewing assignments 1. Final time. Every alarm, every emergency system, every light this aircraft has, trigger them all simultaneously when I give the signal. Mansfield nodded, his hands already positioned over the aircraft's electrical systems. The billionaire who'd started the flight mocking an elderly passenger was now risking his life to save strangers, drawing on technical expertise that would make the difference between life and death. Captain Torres, I need those fuel diversions. Exactly 30 seconds after we deploy the emergency slides. The timing has to be perfect. Too early and we lose our cover. Too late and we're sitting ducks. Torres checked his improvised detonation system, constructed from galley equipment and aircraft components. Roger that. One fuel fire special, delivered precisely on schedule. Ruth Kowalski, despite her age and head injury, had appointed herself commander of civilian evacuation. I'll get those hostages to the tree line, she said with Brooklyn confidence. 40 years of managing teenagers prepared me for handling scared people under pressure. Jennifer Hayes, baby Emma strapped securely to her chest in an improvised carrier, had surprised everyone by revealing marksmanship training from her father. College rifle team, for years, she explained. I never thought I'd need those skills to protect my daughter. Dmitry Volkov, his loyalty to his father completely shattered, provided final intelligence about Viktor's tactical preferences. He'll try to take you alive for interrogation, he warned Seagal. My father enjoys breaking strong men personally. It's his greatest weakness. Outside, Viktor's voice boomed across the airstrip through his bullhorn. Time is up. Bring me what I want, or watch children die for your defiance. Now, Seagal said quietly. Pandemonium erupted simultaneously on multiple fronts. Emergency slides deployed around the aircraft with explosive hisses, creating instant barriers that disrupted Viktor's carefully planned kill zones. Every alarm system Flight 447 possessed screamed to life. Fire warnings, pressure alerts, navigation failures, creating a cacophony that confused and disoriented the waiting gunmen. Seagal rolled off the wing and used the landing gear as cover while the slides inflated around him. His first target was the sniper positioned on the control tower, a precise throw of his titanium tactical pin that struck the Russian in the throat, sending him tumbling from his elevated position. Captain Torres ignited the spilled aviation fuel exactly on schedule, creating walls of flame that cut off 3 of Viktor's men from their support positions. The fire provided both cover and chaos, forcing the remaining gunmen to reposition while dealing with unexpected obstacles that in the confusion. Ruth Kowalski led a desperate charge toward the civilian hostages, her teacher's voice cutting through the chaos as she organized terrified townspeople for evacuation. Move, now, follow me, and keep your heads down. Jennifer Hayes, despite having an infant strapped to her chest, provided covering fire with remarkable accuracy. Her college marksmanship training proved invaluable as she dropped 2 of Viktor's men with precise shots to center mass. Bradley Mansfield continued operating the aircraft systems like a conductor, leading a symphony of destruction, timing each new distraction to maximize confusion among the enemy forces. But Viktor Kozlov was far from finished. As flames and chaos engulfed his carefully planned operation, the arms dealer proved why he'd survived decades in the criminal underworld. Instead of panicking, he adapted, using the confusion to advance toward his ultimate prize, Steven Seagal himself. The final confrontation between good and evil was about to begin in earnest. The battle for the Alaskan airstrip transformed into a deadly game of cat and mouse among burning fuel pools and concrete barriers. Steven Seagal moved through the chaos with the fluid precision of a master predator, using every environmental advantage to systematically eliminate Victor's forces while protecting the escaping civilians. His combat style was poetry written in violence, each movement flowing seamlessly into the next. Decades of Aikido training combined with federal agent techniques, creating an almost supernatural ability to be where enemies didn't expect him. When two of Victor's men tried to flank his position, Seagal appeared behind them like a shadow, breaking necks with precise strikes before they could turn around. The fire barriers created by Captain Torres's fuel ignition had divided the battlefield into separate zones, forcing Victor's disciplined unit into smaller, more manageable groups. Seagal exploited these divisions ruthlessly, picking off isolated gunmen while using the flames and smoke as concealment. Jennifer Hayes proved that maternal protection could transform ordinary people into extraordinary fighters. With baby Emma secure against her chest, she moved with deadly purpose, her college marksmanship training allowing her to provide precision fire support from behind aircraft debris. Each shot was calculated to protect the escaping hostages while conserving precious ammunition. Ruth Kowalski's evacuation of the civilian hostages displayed leadership that would have made her late husband proud. Despite being 78 and injured, she organized terrified townspeople with the same authority she'd used to manage Brooklyn classrooms, getting 5 innocents to safety while bullets flew overhead. But Viktor Kozlov was proving why he'd built a criminal empire through decades of surviving violent confrontations. The arms dealer moved through the battlefield with predatory intelligence, using his men as distractions while positioning himself for the prize he truly wanted: personal combat with the federal agent who'd disrupted his operation. Agent Sullivan. Victor's cultured voice carried across the burning airstrip. Enough hiding behind civilians and tricks. Face me like the warrior you pretend to be. Seagal emerged from behind a concrete barrier, his weathered hands empty but positioned for instant action. At 73, he moved with the centered balance of someone who'd spent 5 decades perfecting the art of controlled violence. "You want to discuss this professionally?" Seagal asked, his voice carrying the calm authority that had become his trademark. Victor smiled with the confidence of someone who'd killed more men than most soldiers. At 62, he maintained the powerful build of his Spetsnaz days, enhanced by expensive physical conditioning and the ruthless pragmatism of a career criminal. "You've cost me considerable money and embarrassment," Victor replied, drawing a combat knife with practiced ease. "I'm going to enjoy taking you apart piece by piece." The two men circled each other among the flames and debris, each recognizing a worthy opponent. Victor fought with military precision combined with criminal brutality, techniques designed to kill quickly and efficiently. But Seagal represented something the arms dealer had never encountered: spiritual discipline married to deadly skill. Their first exchange was explosive. Victor's knife thrust met by Seagal's wrist control, redirecting the blade while simultaneously striking pressure points that should have paralyzed the Russian's arm. But Victor's conditioning and pain tolerance were extraordinary, allowing him to continue fighting despite damage that would have stopped lesser men. The duel became a brutal test of endurance and will, with Victor using every dirty trick learned in decades of violence, while Seagal relied on the centered power of Aikido principles. Around them, the battle continued as survivors fought for their lives. But this personal combat would determine the ultimate fate of everyone who'd started the day as innocent passengers on Flight 447. The final confrontation between justice and corruption had begun in earnest. The duel between Steven Seagal and Viktor Kozlov raged across the burning airfield with the intensity of two apex predators fighting for supremacy. Viktor proved himself far more than a boardroom criminal. Every movement revealed decades of Spetsnaz training maintained through years of personal violence. his combat knife weaving deadly patterns designed to open arteries and crush vital organs. But Seagal fought with something Victor had never encountered: the centered power of someone who'd achieved true mastery over both body and spirit. Each of Victor's brutal attacks was met with Aikido precision that redirected force rather than opposing it, turning the Russians' own momentum against him in ways that defied conventional combat logic. Victor's knife, thrust toward Seagal's heart, was caught in a wrist control that sent the blade spinning harmlessly away while simultaneously driving the arms dealer's face into a concrete barrier. But Victor rolled with the impact, using his military training to absorb punishment while positioning for a counterattack that nearly took Seagal's head off. "You're good, old man," Victor gasped, blood streaming from his shattered nose. "But I've been killing since before you made your first movie." Their fight ranged across the chaos of the airfield, using debris and obstacles as weapons. Victor demonstrated the ruthless pragmatism that had built his criminal empire, throwing burning fuel at Seagal's eyes while attempting to drive a broken antenna through his chest. But Seagal's spiritual discipline allowed him to remain centered, even in the chaos of Mortal Kombat. When Victor's desperate charge brought them together in close quarters, the Aikido master demonstrated why legends are born from reality rather than Hollywood fantasy. The technique was pure poetry, a throw that used Victor's own momentum to send him crashing into the aircraft's landing gear with enough force to crack ribs and collapse a lung. But even wounded, the arms dealer proved his deadly resilience, producing a concealed pistol from his jacket. Around them, the battle was reaching its climax. Ruth Kowalski had successfully evacuated all the civilian hostages to the tree line, where Jennifer Hayes provided covering fire with deadly accuracy. Bradley Mansfield continued creating chaos with the aircraft systems, while Captain Torres's fuel fires had neutralized most of Victor's remaining men. But suddenly, the distinctive sound of military helicopters filled the air. Federal agents and military forces were finally arriving, drawn by Seagal's earlier emergency transmissions and the obvious signs of battle at the remote airfield. Victor's face contorted with rage as he realized his carefully planned operation was collapsing. Around him, "You may have won this battle, Agent Sullivan, but my network spans continents. Kill me, and 5 more operations will launch within the week." Seagal stood over the wounded arms dealer, his breathing controlled despite the intense combat. For a moment, he considered ending Victor permanently. The world would certainly be safer without this particular monster. But Ruth Kowalski's voice cut through his contemplation. "Don't become like him, son. We're better than that." The words carried the moral authority of someone who'd faced down evil before and chosen justice over vengeance. Seagal's hand moved to a precise pressure point on Victor's neck, rendering the arms dealer unconscious without causing permanent damage. "Some victories are worth more than the satisfaction of killing," he said quietly. As federal helicopters landed around the burning airfield, the arrival of federal reinforcements transformed the chaotic battlefield into a scene of controlled justice. Agent Rebecca Martinez led a full FBI tactical team that secured the airfield with military precision, finally bringing overwhelming force to bear against what remained of Viktor Kozlov's criminal operation. "Agent Sullivan, report," Martinez called out as her team moved to secure the unconscious arms dealer and his surviving subordinates. "Primary target neutralized," Seagal replied, his voice steady despite the intense combat he'd just survived. "Briefcase recovered, arms shipment secured, civilian casualties minimized." The tactical assessment was professional, but it couldn't capture the human drama that had unfolded among ordinary people forced to extraordinary courage. Across the airfield, survivors were emerging from cover, their faces showing the stunned disbelief of those who'd faced death and somehow prevailed. Ruth Kowalski, despite being 78 and injured, had successfully evacuated 5 civilian hostages through terrain that would have challenged people half her age. Her Brooklyn-bred toughness had proven more valuable than any military training, inspiring terrified townspeople to follow her leadership when their lives depended on it. Jennifer Hayes sat in the snow with baby Emma, both mother and child having survived an ordeal that would have broken most people. The young woman's marksmanship skills had proved crucial in the final battle, Her protective instincts transformed into deadly accuracy that saved multiple lives. Bradley Mansfield stood beside the damaged aircraft, his transformation from arrogant billionaire to genuine hero now complete. His technical expertise and pilot training had been essential to their survival. But more importantly, he discovered that courage meant protecting others rather than protecting wealth. Captain Torres and his flight crew were being treated by federal medics, their professional competence under impossible circumstances having saved 200 lives through skill, determination, and grace under pressure that exemplified the best of their profession. But it was Dmitry Volkov's situation that presented the most complex moral challenge. The young Russian had turned against his own father to protect innocent people, ultimately choosing justice over family loyalty in a decision that would define the rest of his life. He helped us, Seagal told Agent Martinez's federal agents. Moved to arrest Dmitry. Without his cooperation, a lot more people would have died today. Martinez nodded, understanding the complexities of criminal justice in cases involving cooperation and redemption. We'll make sure the prosecutors know about his assistance. Sometimes people deserve a second chance to choose the right side. Viktor Kozlov regained consciousness as he was being loaded into a federal transport, his gray eyes still burning with the cold intelligence that had built a criminal empire. Even defeated and captured, he radiated the dangerous charisma of someone who'd spent decades manipulating others through fear and greed. "This changes nothing, Agent Sullivan," he said, his cultured voice carrying across the airfield. "You've disrupted one operation. My network spans 3 continents. There will always be another Bradley Mansfield, another greedy fool willing to trade principles for profit." But Seagal's response carried the quiet confidence of someone who'd dedicated his life to fighting such evil. "Then there will always be people like us to stop them." The arms dealer's weapons cache, military drones, surface-to-air missiles, advanced communication equipment worth $500 million, was secured by federal agents who would trace every serial number and connection, unraveling criminal networks that had operated in shadows for decades. As the sun set over the Alaskan wilderness, the survivors of Flight 447 prepared for evacuation to medical facilities and debriefing sessions that would help them process the trauma of their ordeal. But they were no longer the same people who'd boarded a routine flight to Tokyo 6 months after the hijacking of Flight 447. The consequences of that terrifying day continued to ripple through the lives of everyone involved, creating changes that would resonate for years to come. The federal courthouse in Anchorage had become the stage for one of the most significant international arms trafficking prosecutions in recent history. Viktor Kozlov sat in the defendant's chair, his distinguished appearance unchanged despite months in federal custody. Even facing multiple life sentences, he maintained the cold dignity of someone who viewed legal proceedings as temporary inconveniences rather than moral reckonings. His cooperation with federal investigators, motivated purely by self-interest, rather than remorse, had led to the dismantling of criminal networks across 3 continents. The defendant's information has prevented an estimated 15,000 deaths from terrorist attacks, Prosecutor Sarah Chun told the court during sentencing. However, this cooperation cannot erase the fact that Viktor Kozlov built his fortune on the suffering of innocent people worldwide. The life sentence was delivered without parole, ensuring that the arms dealer would spend his remaining years reflecting on the ultimate futility of choosing power over principle. As he was led away in shackles, Victor's final glance toward the gallery showed no remorse, only the bitter satisfaction of someone who'd negotiated the best possible deal for himself. Dmitry Volkov's case proved more complex, representing the possibility of redemption even among those who'd chosen violence. His cooperation during the hijacking and extensive assistance in dismantling his father's network had earned him a place in the Federal Witness Protection Program rather than a prison cell. "I spent 23 years trying to earn a monster's approval," he told the court during his testimony. "Agent Sullivan and those passengers showed me what real courage looks like, protecting others instead of protecting yourself." Under his new identity, Dmitry had established a non-profit organization dedicated to helping other victims of human trafficking and organized crime, finding purpose in rebuilding lives that criminals like his father had destroyed. Bradley Mansfield's transformation proved to be permanent and profound. The billionaire who'd spent the flight mocking an elderly passenger had donated $500 million to veterans organizations, victim assistance programs, and anti-trafficking efforts. His company, CyberVault Technologies, had been restructured to refuse contracts with any organization that couldn't pass stringent ethical reviews. Money can't buy back your soul, Mansfield told a congressional hearing on corporate responsibility. But it can be used to build something better than what you destroyed through greed. His net worth had dropped by half, but for the first time in years, he slept without nightmares about the consequences of his choices. Ruth Kowalski had become an unlikely celebrity. Her memoir, Never Judge the Quiet Ones, topping bestseller lists, while inspiring millions of readers with its message about finding courage in ordinary moments. At 79, she'd become a sought-after speaker at schools and community organizations, sharing her Brooklyn-bred wisdom about standing up to bullies regardless of their weapons or wealth. Heroes aren't special people, she told audiences across the country. They're ordinary people who choose to do extraordinary things when the moment demands it. Jennifer Hayes and Baby Ruth, named for the elderly woman who'd shown everyone what courage truly meant, lived in a new house that Mansfield had purchased for them, though Jennifer insisted on paying him back through monthly installments that would take 20 years to complete. "I won't accept charity," she told the billionaire firmly, "but I'll gladly accept the chance to raise my daughter in a world where people like you learn to choose principles over profit." The baby bore no memory of her terrifying first airplane ride, but she would grow up hearing stories about the day ordinary people chose to fight against impossible odds rather than surrender to evil. 2 years after the hijacking of Flight 447, Steven Seagal found himself in the familiar environment of another commercial aircraft, traveling under another alias for another undercover mission. The cyclical nature of his work, fighting the same types of criminals in different locations, might have discouraged a lesser man. But Seagal understood that the battle between good and evil was eternal and required constant vigilance. He sat quietly in seat 12F, reading a worn copy of The Art of War, his weathered hands turning pages with the same meditative focus that had sustained him through decades of real combat. To his fellow passengers, he appeared to be nothing more than an aging man catching a flight, unaware they were traveling with someone who'd spent his life protecting people like them from dangers they'd never imagined. The mission briefing from Agent Martinez had been grimly familiar. Another arms dealer, another technology facilitator, another web of corruption that threatened innocent lives. The criminals changed names and locations, but their fundamental evil remained constant: the willingness to profit from other people's suffering without regard for moral consequences. Flight attendant Maria Santos offered him coffee with the professional courtesy that had become standard in commercial aviation, but her smile carried genuine warmth rather than mere politeness. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" "Just the coffee. Thank you," Seagal replied quietly, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had faced down terrorists and arms dealers. "It's going to be a long flight." 3 rows ahead, a loud passenger in an expensive suit was berating a flight attendant about the quality of first-class service, his voice carrying the same entitled arrogance that Seagal had encountered countless times before. The man's behavior drew disapproving glances from other passengers, but no one intervened in what appeared to be a minor inconvenience rather than genuine crisis. "Do you people have any idea who I am?" the passenger demanded, his voice rising to levels that disturbed everyone within hearing. "I could buy 3 of these planes with what I make in a single quarter." The words were almost identical to those Bradley Mansfield had used 2 years earlier, before learning that money couldn't protect him from the consequences of his choices. But this passenger, another tech executive, another self-made billionaire, another man who'd confused wealth with worth, had yet to learn that lesson. Seagal closed his eyes and began the meditation breathing that centered his mind for whatever challenges lay ahead. Around him, ordinary people pursued ordinary lives, unaware that their safety depended on quiet professionals who chose to stand between civilization and the monsters who sought to destroy it. The obnoxious passenger's voice grew louder as he began filming himself for social media, apparently having noticed another traveler he thought would provide entertainment for his online followers. "Hey, isn't that the old guy from those action movies? What's his name?" "Steven Seagal." But this time, Seagal simply smiled and kept his eyes closed, secure in the knowledge that real strength came from protecting others rather than proving anything to strangers. The gratitude of the people he'd saved aboard Flight 447. Letters from Ruth Kowalski. Photos of baby Ruth taking her first steps. Updates on Dimitri's nonprofit work. Reports of Bradley Mansfield's continued transformation provided all the validation he needed. Some people never learn. The passenger behind him muttered, clearly recognizing the pattern of entitled behavior that had nearly destroyed so many lives 2 years earlier. Seagal opened his eyes briefly, meeting the concerned passenger's gaze with quiet confidence. "They will," he said simply, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd spent his life ensuring that bullies eventually faced consequences for their actions. The aircraft continued its journey through peaceful skies, carrying its cargo of human dreams and fears toward whatever destination awaited them. And in seat 12F, a quiet professional prepared for whatever challenges would come, ready to protect innocent lives with the same dedication that had defined his entire career. The battle between good and evil would continue, and Steven Seagal would be there to fight it. If you like the story, please watch another story on our channel and subscribe to the channel.